Okay, I think we're ready to get started here. Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. I also want to thank Karen Sander and her team at the Graduate Center's Office of Public Programs for helping us to sponsor this event. Please note that our next event will be on Wednesday, December 7th at 6:30 p.m. when I will be interviewing Stacy Schiff, who will join us in person to discuss her new biography of Samuel Adams. Please mark your calendars and register for this and our other events on the Leon Levy website. And if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our website so that you can be notified of future events. But tonight I am really delighted to introduce Aidan Levy, a former Leon Levy Fellow, who is here with us on Zoom to discuss his new biography of the jazz musician, Sonny Rollins. He will be in conversation with Gary Giddins, the former director of the Leon Levy Center and the celebrated biographer, among others, of Bing Crosby. Please look for all these books online at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Aidan Levy is the author of Dirty Boulevard, The Life and Music of Lou Reed, and editor of Patti Smith on Patti Smith, Interviews and Encounters. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Village Voice, JazzTimes, and The Nation. He wrote Saxophone Colossus, The Life and Music of Sonny Rollins, in part while he was a Leon Levy Fellow in the year 2016 to 17. Gary Giddins wrote the Weatherbird jazz column in the Village Voice from 1973 until the year 2003. He co-founded the American Jazz Orchestra and served as executive director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography from 2011 to 2016. His essays on music and film have appeared in dozens of publications and have earned him a Jazz Journalists Association Lifetime Achievement Award, a Guggenheim, a Peabody, a Grammy, and 6 ASCAP Deems Taylor Awards for excellence in music criticism. His Visions of Jazz received a 1998 National Book Critics Circle Award and the Ralph J. Gleason Music Book Award. He won a second Gleason Award and other honors for his 2-volume Life of Bing Crosby. He wrote and co-directed 3 documentary films and is featured in many others, including Ken Burns's Jazz and Tom Sergal's Fire Music. His books include the biographies Satchmo and Celebrated Bird, the essay collections Weatherbird and Warning Shadows, and the textbook Jazz. He is now at work on a biography of George Gershwin. Giddins lives in New York City with his wife, Deborah Halper. Aidan and Gary will be in conversation now for about 45 minutes, and then they'll take some questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the chat box at the bottom of your screens to type in your questions, and Gary will try to get to as many as he can. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. On that note, I now turn the evening over to Gary Giddins. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Kai. It's really nice to be back here. It's been a while. And I'm so delighted to have Aidan here because I remember when his application came in, and although I tried to remain pretty much above jury decisions, when there was a jazz application, I would always take a look at it. And none of them particularly knocked me out, but Aidan's really did. And I was going to make sure that somehow it was read if the jury didn't go there on its own. And man, I didn't have to do a damn thing because the jury was unanimous. Everybody was knocked out by the application. And Sonny Rollins is, I think everybody probably who signed in for this knows, is just one of the great figures in American music. And there has never been a jazz book quite like this, in its length, in its detail. And this is with cuts that must have been pretty painful. But I know inevitably that someone, maybe an Amazon reviewer or somebody else, is going to say, did we really need to hear about every session and every gig? And the answer is, of course, yes. Yes, we definitely do. That's what makes this book so fascinating. It's impossible to read the stories behind the record sessions without just wanting to hear them again. And that alone made the whole experience of reading it very exciting. So let's begin with how you got the idea and how you went about it, and maybe what your experience at the Levy Center was.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Honored to be here with you and to be back at the Graduate Center. I haven't been here since, I think, before the pandemic. So it's still a labyrinthine building, but I managed to find my way to this room. But anyway, yeah, I've always been a huge fan of Sonny's music. And the first album that I bought with my own money was Saxophone Colossus. So I would just play that over and over again. I had it on CD, so eventually got the LP. But this was the CD era, which now seems to some extent be behind us. I'm not sure, but anyway, I think it started skipping at one point.
The whole record industry is behind us.
The whole, well, that's a subject for another day. But I'm a saxophone player as well. So Sonny's just always been a hero. And I guess 10 years ago now, I had the opportunity to do an interview with him when I was writing editorial content for Blue Note Records. And I was so moved by the conversation and by his generosity of spirit that I started looking even deeper into his life and career and his music. And I read the few books that were out there, and I wanted to know more. I was hoping that there would be something that would attempt to do justice to this colossal figure. So I then began doing some research and seeing if anybody else was working on the project. I wasn't aware of anything, so I reached out to Sonny to see how he felt about the idea, and the idea of a biography, that is. And of course, there'd been books on Sonny before, and I was surprised that apparently he was okay with it. So at that point, I decided to apply to the Levy Center to see if I could get some support to work on this project, knowing that it would take many years as an undertaking. And I did maybe several interviews and quite a bit of archival research in advance of filing that application. Of course, then knowing that that would just be the tip of the iceberg. So
when you were at that stage, did you know that Sonny was about to deliver his entire archive to Schomburg?
I had heard about that.
Okay.
I had heard about that from some archivists that I'd been in touch with, and that was just so exciting to hear about. And I wasn't sure what was in the archive, though. I had not seen any of it because it wasn't available. It wasn't processed yet. I had a feeling that it might be what it turned out to be, but I'd heard from some folks that it wasn't that extensive, which not a big problem. Most jazz archives are not that extensive. And then when the archive finally opened to researchers, I was blown away because it's really one of the most extensive jazz archives in existence. There's a handful of others that maybe are similar in scope, Max Roach being one of them at the Library of
Library.
Congress. So that was one of the places where I started my research.
Mhm.
But getting to immerse myself in Sonny's archive was just a thrill, really. And so to biographers, I think that that's kind of what we live for.
Yeah, it's a dream. And typical Sonny, he put no restrictions on it. Almost every archive, from what I hear, that comes to the New York Public Library or the Library of Congress from a living person will say, this you can inventory and researchers can see it, but these letters, not until I've been dead for 25 years or not until I'm dead. But Sonny just, I can tell you that Bill Kelly, who used to be the president here and who was really responsible for obtaining it, was stunned that he just said, no, put it all out there.
Mhm. There are some restrictions, but it's mostly on touring files.
Oh, okay.
And the reason for that is that it contains personal information of some of the musicians that worked with him and other folks. So social security numbers, things like that.
But all the letters to his wife
But
and all of that.
all the letters,
Yeah,
no restrictions, which is very unusual for an archive
right.
of a living person. And as you said, usually there would be restrictions for 25, 30, 40 years. So getting to, as I said, immerse myself in that material just fundamentally shifted my perspective on what this project was going to be, which is to say that I knew it would be a long book, but within about 30 minutes of getting access to those archives, I realized it would be a very long book because Sonny saved almost everything. And we're not going to say everything, but when I think about the lives of people I know, so much just goes to the shredder.
Mhm.
Now we have email, but I mean, how much correspondence are people inclined to really save? But Sonny saved so much of that material that it really made it possible to tell the story of a jazz musician's life in a level of detail that we wouldn't usually be able to have. So yeah, I mean, he going back to the early 50s really is where you have material. And this would include practice notes written on music manuscript paper, as well as his writings in prose. And some of it's quite moving. And I was able to quote that in the book, which really I think gives deep insight into what motivates Sonny.
He's tremendously candid throughout the book, and I've known him now for, oh my God, almost 50 years. And I think every time I've ever spoken to him, I walked away knowing stuff I didn't know before. But the very first time I met him was at the Half Note in 1974. I went there one night with Ira Gibler, who knew him all the way going back to the Prestige to Saxophone Colossus.
Mm-hmm.
And Sonny had just gotten off, was just getting off from the first set. We were at ringside, and he knows Ira very well, and he just sat down at our table, and Ira introduced me, and he said that I had just started writing for the Village Voice, and he got very, he was very upset about a piece that had just appeared about him in The Voice, and he was like shaking his head, and he said they don't really know, and I had read that review, and whatever else you would say about it, it was extremely positive. And I said, Mr. Rollins, what? I think I read that review. That was a very favorable review. And he looked at me and he said, yes, but we played badly. He said, if you can't trust them when they say when you're playing bad, why would you trust them when they say you're playing good? I had to think about that for a while, but that's typical Sonny. I mean, the one time in all the years I've known him, that he actually got angry at me was after a stadium concert he did in Perugia. And the audience wouldn't leave. I mean, it was magnificent. And people were cheering and cheering. And finally, they started to clear out the stadium. And I walked back and I said, God, Sonny, that was extraordinary. And he said, no, if you had been in, I forget where, Norway, that was extraordinary. This was not, this disappointed me. I'm surprised at you, Giddins. This was not it.
Well, he was always his own worst critic, still is.
Still is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's something that I think really comes out in the book. And just to get back to the archive for a second, he also, Sonny and his wife, Lucille, who was his manager, kept most of the files from recording sessions, especially after Sonny went to Milestone. That was around when she took over as manager.
72, yeah.
Exactly. And you can see Sonny responding to playback and just giving his own assessment of what he heard. And he really is unsparing in his self-criticism, as you can imagine. Well, he would just say, no. And, you know, so as you know, sometimes the critics were not always so favorable.
Oh man, one of the things that made me realize, even though I'm not a musician or a musicologist, that I might be able to write about it, was a really unforgettably idiotic review that appeared in the Long Island Press, where I grew up. And to this day, I don't know the actual name of the critic because he used a pen name, which gives you an idea of his wit. Al Legro. And he was reviewing remember the Modern Jazz Quartet album at Lenox, where Sonny plays 2 tracks on it.
Yeah.
And he said that he didn't like Rollins. He thought it was all a lot of hype, and that he's not coherent. He can't sustain a solo. And he gives us an example on one track that he starts playing, and then he just goes silent for a while, and then he starts playing again, and then he goes silent, and there's no momentum, there's no, coherence. I said, I have to hear that. So I bought that record immediately. And the section he was talking about, Sonny and Connie Kay were trading 4s. He thought that the drum part was Sonny failing to continue his solo. So you have that level of criticism at that time. I mean, that was unusually clueless. But, even Nat Hentoff, who became a great admirer of Sonny, attacked him the first time he heard him.
He was hard on Sonny for years.
Yeah.
And that was something that surprised me.
Yeah.
Because I got to know Nat a little bit. I knew that he was a great supporter of Sonny. And when I looked at the archive, at the record, it wasn't there until really around the mid to late 50s. And he was still hard on him. He was hard on his tone. He was hard on his sense of harmonic development. It was not like Sonny Rollins burst onto the scene and was instantly the Sonny Rollins. It took him a long time to get there.
Well, that's for sure. Were you at the conversation I did here on stage years ago?
I was not, but it was fortunately taped.
Right.
So I'll let you.
Well, there was just this one. I picked 4 or 5 pieces to play, and one of them was the
Kansas, I believe.
Well, the Kansas piece from the Foley Theater, which has never been released. I knew that would, kill the audience, and it did. And Sonny reluctantly conceded that was pretty good. And then he said, "But I can do better." But before that, I played. We were talking about the period with drugs, and he comes out, and the first thing he does is record the work time. And the first with the Max, and was it Ray Bryant, right? Was Ray Bryant on that?
Yes.
I think so. So the first track is there's no business like show business. And Sonny plays, I think, a killing solo, including the verse, which nobody ever plays or sings, which he does just as a bass tenor duet.
And Brian
And-
had barely rehearsed that with him too. So he was, I think,
He-
struggling a little
he's-
bit. That's what he said in his oral history, at least.
Well,
The
after I
recordings
played it
unbelievable.
and the audience cheered madly, I said, "How does that sound to you now?" And he said, "It's excruciating. I can't believe I used to play like that."
Mhm.
And so this is sort of just very characteristic. You know, you talk about the horn culture session, and one of the things he used to do,
And you were there for
yeah, I didn't know it until that afternoon, was if he hated a take, he would play a quote from Stella by Starlight, which is a song he hates.
Mhm.
And that's supposed to cue to the producer that you can't use any of this. But he doesn't just necessarily stop the take. He will keep playing. But the Stella by Starlight is the warning that we're just doing this. This is just a practice session.
Mhm.
And then when the record came out, they put out some of that, and that's what really ended up with Lucille becoming his producer.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that the Roadshow series that came out starting in the 2000s has really been a corrective to some of the ideas that have been out there about Sonny's later work. And I know that you were involved with that, as well as Carl Smith and
Well,
and May.
Carl is the one who created that archive.
Yeah.
Carl Smith is a Rollins fanatic who has collected hundreds of performances that he gave off of soundboards. I mean, I don't know what his connections are, but he got them off the soundboard. So the sound was excellent. I think it was Carl who got me the Foley concert in Kansas, which
It probably was.
which hasn't been released. But I went off the wall. Just, I mean, when I read about Sonny, it was usually hyperbolic, or at least a lot of people accused me of that. But there was a concert he did with Branford Marsalis, and when she played her Three Little Words, that I thought was about the greatest thing I'd ever heard. And Carl finally found that disc, and he called me and he said, "You're right about Three Little Words."
Yep, he's got that. So I was able to visit Carl in Maine as part of my research, and Carl works in high fidelity audio. That's his business. So his listening room is the most state-of-the-art listening room that you could probably be in just about anywhere. I mean, I've read about things, but after talking to Carl, I was really convinced, and then I was just blown away by the experience of listening to Sonny in that environment. And yeah, Carl wasn't always a Sonny convert, but when he went to see him, I think about 25 years ago now, he really felt like he discovered a new island, and people didn't know that Sonny was the greatest living improviser. So that really motivated Carl to go on this mission to make sure that the world knew. And I think that we're fortunate that he did that work, because those archival releases that came out, if anybody out there hasn't heard them all, go and pick those up.
I
right
just
away.
wish they'd keep putting them out. I wanted to say something else about the length of this book, because this confirms my belief that the more forensically detailed you are in covering any subject. We have some letters, some questions. Okay. The more detailed you are, the more you go into it, the more you really focus on what makes an artist function, instead of it becoming folding into this one person, it tends to go out, and it tells you something much larger about the nature of creativity. And this book, one of the things that I have to say, I think literally there's not a page where I didn't learn something I didn't know. But what I found so fascinating is that you've captured what the life of the music is, what it's like to play these clubs, what it's like to be on road tours, the complexity of making records if you're serious, the rehearsals, the auditions of different drummers, all of the stuff that he goes through, constantly thinking and rethinking himself. There's a great passage, I can't remember who said it, but he's talking about the really sleazy jazz clubs that Max and Clifford Brown and that band, when Sonny was in it, played. And he says something like Lenny Bruce used to call them the toilets. And they were run by these low-level mobsters who were too dumb to pimp or deal drugs. So they became jazz club operators. Mm-hmm. And when they failed at that, the only thing left was to be informants for the FBI. Do you remember who said that?
I think that was David Amram.
Oh, yes, I think that's right.
I think that's David Amram, the composer, French horn player, who's still alive and kicking.
Very much so.
So, I was honored to be able to sit down with him and do an interview for this book. He was really eloquent on that subject.
Yes, he's hilarious. But yeah, it just gives such a feeling for the period. And of course, I mentioned Clifford Brown, and I don't think anybody's ever done that story as succinctly and as well as you do. It's still heartbreaking.
Well, yeah, I know that Sonny said that he still thinks about Clifford all the time. One of the surprising details that came out, just apropos of what you were saying about David Amram's quote in the book, is that Clifford Brown was known as this warm, beautiful musician, but that if there was any funny business at the clubs, he was really the enforcer. Mm-hmm. So one time, it was somewhere upstate New York, in Buffalo, I want to say, but it may have been Rochester, that there was maybe something not kosher going on with the money, and Clifford would just go in and make sure that everything was copacetic. So, but the life of a touring musician is rough, and that's something I really wanted to bring out here. I think that some people might imagine that there's some glamour to it, but especially in the early 50s and all throughout the 50s, really, I think it was a very difficult existence living out of suitcases. And
not in the best hotels.
And not in the best hotels. Having to use the Green Book and be barred from many of the hotels on tour. Sometimes when Sonny would be on tour, there was one tour called Jazz for Moderns in 1958. And sometimes they'd be able to stay in the same hotel, but there would be all sorts of discrimination that they'd face. This was the first time that Sonny toured the South. And he had recently put out the Freedom Suite, his brilliant civil rights album, of which that composition is the centerpiece. And he was shocked, I think, to some extent, to discover that there were some great fans of his music at one of these Southern colleges who couldn't get behind the message. And so that was just one tense moment that came out in this book. Mm-hmm. Of course, that album was more or less pulled and then reissued as Shadow Waltz. So
yes, that was a very strange thing.
Yeah,
to hide it behind the waltz.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. But if you look at that reissue, you'll also see that Sonny bears a striking resemblance to Frederick Douglass, which I thought was a way to still make sure that message was there.
Who shot the photo? Do you remember?
I think it was Joe Alper, I want to say. I think that's the photographer.
Yeah. One of the things about Sonny that makes him, let me say first that I think one of the reasons that Sonny is so outstanding and has so kept everybody's attention since he was 19 years old in 1949 and made those records with Bud and Babs Gonzalez, is that he is completely devoted to telling a story. He never runs changes. He never does the usual thing. He's got all the chops for it, but it doesn't interest him. And you're saying that you were talking about the reset created by the roadshow albums, because he really does think of an LP or a CD studio recording as something very different than what a concert could be. And in concert, he will do things that could be absolutely thrilling that would be deadly dull on a record. I keep thinking of this concert he did at Central Park, where it was about to rain any second. The clouds were really, really dark out there. And he got into this thing where he was playing this riff over and over again, and he's pushing, and you just know he's gonna get out of it. And when he finally does, the place, was ecstatic. It was just unforgettable. You couldn't do that on a record if you were sitting at home. He could do that for 15 minutes. I saw him one night play Take the A Train, just the head, for 45 minutes. He just went chorus after, and after every chorus came to like bar 32, you thought, okay, now he's going to take off. No, right back into the head.
And that's why the Carl Smith collection was really so important to this book. And Carl actually let me borrow the whole collection
No
for
kidding.
the duration of the
I'm
book.
jealous.
Yeah, it's still in my house, actually. Carl is such an organized, impeccable archivist, though, that the entire collection fits in 2 relatively small boxes that would fit on this tray right here. So it's hundreds of recordings and thousands of hours of material. And I mean, I was really just in heaven listening to this stuff. But you were absolutely right that in a live setting, Sonny might be able to extemporize for an entire hour on one song, and that's not something that you would find on an LP, at least. If you look at Our Man in Jazz, 1962,
which is edited.
George Avakian had to edit it down because it wouldn't fit on one side of an LP. So, and you actually can, some of that material, I think you can hear the extended cuts from that. But that album was really one of the first that did justice to what Sonny could do when he went long.
And do you remember, I know you do because it's in the book, the terrible reviews he got for the Museum of Modern Art?
Yeah, but I think that
where he, for those who don't know that record, he just plays one improvisation that quotes 40 or 50 different pieces. And the energy is incredible. Being there was thrilling, but people who just heard it on the record, they didn't know what to make of it.
Yeah, and I asked Sonny about that, and he actually said it was not one of his preferred recordings because he was having, I think, some dental problems at that time. But I don't know. I really like that recording. I think that he gets at something about the human condition there. Just going out and having the courage to be just playing by himself for such an extended period. And at the end of that, you can really hear a sense of rhythm come into the performance. And I don't know, I just thought that there was a certain resiliency to that you really always get from Sonny Rollins.
And his response to cabs honking down on Fifth Avenue.
He does respond to the cabs.
He hears everything.
I know that when he was up on the Williamsburg Bridge, sometimes he would respond to the tugboats. So, that's a nice duet.
One of the sections that I liked enormously was the whole RCA Victor thing. Because remember when most of them were released, and it was a very almost incomprehensible what they were thinking because each record was so different from the previous one. And there was a lot of talk about how much money went into it. And you really made me listen to them all over again. I had forgotten that since if I have a choice, I'll go to my vinyl first. And so I pulled out What's New, and What's New doesn't have the Don't Stop the Carnival that came out, I
That's
guess,
right.
only on the European edition.
Only in Japan or something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe it's European edition. Yeah, it's not on the American LP.
What a dumb thing,
And
because
it's-
that would have
it's-
made it so much more commercial, I think.
Yep. And there's another outtake from that album where Sonny plays Brazil. And I mean, that I hope that gets released one day, because what he does there, I've rarely heard an improvising musician do. So there's a lot of material from that RCA period that I think that Sonny deemed to be substandard.
We talked about this. One of the tunes that he did 2 or 3 times, I think, was Love Walked In. The Gershwin, the last thing Gershwin ever wrote. And he never released ever any version of it. And yet there's quite a few.
He did Satin Doll in there. A lot of standards that he never released, because of course Sonny knew more standards than anybody. I think the Branford Marsalis quote was that if you want to know about Sonny Rollins, first you have to learn 10,000 songs. And
One night he was playing at Tramps on 15th Street, and Debbie and I were there, and he saw me walk in, and he played, he went into Prisoner of Love, and he played Prisoner of Love for 20 minutes. And afterwards, when we went to say hello, he said, "Giddins, did you hear that I played Prisoner of Love? Russ Colombo, Bing's rival."
that's a deep cut.
Yeah.
And I just want to remind everybody there too that if you haven't read Volume 2, it's here. It's been here for a while now, and it's really just a continuation of what I think is one of the greatest biographies ever written. So, but yeah, Russ
Thanks.
Colombo, Prisoner of Love.
And Sonny, when at one point you asked him who are the people he likes so that he grew up listening to, the first 2 he says are Bing and Louis Armstrong.
Yeah.
And I remember him telling me, I'm going to do a whole album of Robin and Ranger.
Well, I think that there's this perception that some people have that Sonny is always trying to mock these tunes that he's recording on like Way Out West.
Tootsie.
Right. Or just you think I'm an old cow hand.
There's no business like show business.
Yeah. But you know, when I asked him about it, he loved those tunes.
He loves those tunes, yeah.
It just happens to be that no one is hipper than Sonny Rollins, but he loves those tunes.
Yeah. Well, Jimmy Heath said to me once that Crosby was the one guy on the air who had time. And he said, because that's where we got all the songs from, the radio. We all grew up listening to the same radio. I remember Archie Shepp, I once asked him, what tenors did you grow up loving? And he said, Stan Getz. And I did a double take. And he said, Gary, we had the same radio you did.
Yeah, so I think the idea that somehow Sonny Rollins shouldn't draw from the Great American Songbook is ludicrous. And I mean, that's what he did for his entire career. I mean, he became really, I think, the greatest interpreter of the Great American Songbook, at least, of his era, of the bebop, hard bop era. I don't think there's really anybody who comes close.
The guy who may come closest is Red Garland.
Okay.
Who he's the one reason Miles recorded things like Diane, really obscure pop songs. He evidently knew every song ever. But I'd say of the great figures of the period, nobody made so many strange choices as Sonny and really dug into. I mean, it's one thing that you play a lot of Irving Berlin and Gershwin and Cole Porter and all the people that Ella chose, because she knew what the Pantheon was, Harold Arlen and so forth. But to say I'm going to do an album of Robin and Ranger is to go really deep into it in a way that most people don't even, He remembered the scores from all those film musicals that he saw. Some of the examples you give are quite startling.
He loved Jerome Kern.
Well,
Sonny loves Jerome Kern.
yeah,
And I mean,
All the Things You Are. That's the one with on the Hawkins.
Yep, with Paul Bley.
With that incredible Paul Bley piano solo. Yeah. He finds things in the songs. I mean, a lot of people, they go right to the changes. But Sonny has as much fun with the melodies as he does with the change.
Yeah, and he knew the lyrics too. That's something that I think he took from Charlie Parker. So you talk about All the Things You Are. I know that Bird would sometimes refer to that as "You Are the Angel Glow."
Yeah, tag.
Exactly. So I think that knowing the lyrics really helps Sonny interpret that material in a way that makes it rise above, even if it's deranged and brought out of its usual context on something like the Sonny Meets Hawk album that we're talking about, with Paul Bley playing that solo. We should check the time here.
What surprised you?
What surprised me? Well, so many things, but I'll say two things. One more serious and another more lighthearted. I knew that Sonny was the hardest working musician in show business, but I didn't realize the extent to which he really was. And that's something that came out of my conversations with him. And it's something that came out in the archive. It's something that came out of listening to all of these recordings going back to the early 50s, that nothing was ever good enough. There was always a push to improve himself. And when I went into the archive, the first thing that I discovered was that he would meticulously take down the exercises that he was working on every day, which were usually referred to as dailies. And it would be exercises involving intervallic relationships, for instance, that he was working through. And this started, the record of this, at least, in the late 50s. And it goes through right until his retirement from performing.
Right.
So we're talking really an almost 60-year period of doing this, and it's hundreds, might be thousands of pages of material.
Yeah.
And if anybody thinks that they don't need to keep working and practicing, then look at Sonny Rollins, who by the time he was 20 years old had really reached a height that almost nobody ever will. But he keeps going and just going forever. I mean, it was really staggering. He always would show up hours early for performances or for recording sessions. He'd be practicing before a concert. He'd be practicing after the concert. You'd hear him practicing in his dressing room. Sometimes when I talked to musicians, they said that the sound check was really where you had to be. But it was all a form of practice in a sense, kind of maybe a rehearsal for the next gig. You might think of it that way. So that's one thing. It's just that Sonny is such a paragon of discipline and had such an unbelievable work ethic that he would never let himself off the hook. And I
Mhm.
think that it was really more about the pursuit of that ideal. I think at some point I hope that Sonny Rollins was able to let himself off the hook and say it's good enough, but something tells me that he never quite did. So that's something that came out of this project. But another thing that I will mention is Sonny is known as really one of the strongest players to ever play this music. He became a bodybuilder of sorts
Mhm.
in the late 50s. And, I think that his reputation is one of being really tougher than anybody. And rightly so. But what I discovered from speaking with Sonny and then also just from going through the archive was how much of an animal lover he is.
Mm.
And the number of photos that I found of Sonny with his dogs or with his cats. Sometimes he'd have 3 cats on him. There was one photo of Sonny with his cat was in front of his Grammys taking a rest. He drew these sketches of animals. He was really quite a good artist. And I think that what came out of that is just the idea that those things aren't mutually exclusive.
Mhm.
That there was a strength of character there. But yeah, Sonny Rollins, a great animal lover. And
Should we look at some questions?
Yes.
What was the most surprising or counterintuitive thing? Oh, you learned about Rollins. I think you just answered that. Gary, want to hear more from Aidan and Sonny, please. David Lewis. I don't know what that means. Was there anything about the process that surprised you while writing? Well, we just did that. The verbal representation of music is notoriously fraught and difficult. Did you have particular jazz critics in the back of your mind as models? And do you feel you yourself were able to depict aspects of Rollins' music?
Sure. Yeah, I'll speak to that for a moment. So one critic that I absolutely had in mind while I was writing this book was Gary Giddins. I think that goes without saying that you've really been such a champion of Sonny's music over the decades now that I had to read, everything that you wrote about his work. So I know that the Silver City box set for Milestone is something that you were involved with as well. That did a
By
lot
accident.
by accident because
Yeah.
that came out of a piece he wrote, isn't that correct?
Right. I just wrote a list of the great performances he had done because everybody always dismissed all those records. And they decided to do a 25th anniversary and they used the list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I had to go deep into Gunther Schuller's Sonny Rollins and the challenge of thematic improvisation, in which Schuller articulates his concept of Sonny as a thematic improviser, and as well as some of the scholarship that tries to complicate that idea a little bit. I ultimately think that the Schuller piece is really a great work of music criticism.
It made everybody listen to not just Sonny, but Monk,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of musicians in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But which critics did I read? Well, I think there's thousands of articles that I read, but the challenge of depicting an aspect of Mr. Rollins' music. Well, in this form, there were, of course, some challenges, and I decided early on that I wouldn't provide notated musical examples, and would leave that to the musicologists out there. But yes, it's always a challenge to describe music in words. This is something that the French theorist Roland Barthes goes into, where he has this essay called The Grain of the Voice. And the idea is really how can you ever get at the thing without resorting to adjectives, without resorting to a kind of adjectival criticism? So that was a challenge. I didn't want to, in this book, resort to superlatives. The idea was to attempt to clarify for the reader something about each recording that they might be able to grasp if they listen to it in musical terms, and sometimes also to try to make sure that it would be, once again, accessible in layman's terms as well. So yeah, that was one way I dealt with that. I could talk about that for a while, but
Talk about his drug addiction. How long did it last? How did he overcome it?
I'll speak to that very briefly. So, like many musicians of Sonny's era, he did deal with what he refers to as the scourge. And I think that it's one of the most inspirational aspects of this book is the fact that Sonny had the conviction to overcome that. And although he did have some help from the time that he spent at the rehab facility in Lexington, Kentucky, it's really something that he did himself. And when he went to Chicago after that, that was when he really had to put the work in. And he began living like a monk, really, and took a job at a typewriter factory as a maintenance person, and they would call him Wally. And he wanted to make sure that he isolated himself from the scene to avoid falling back into bad habits. And he did it. He beat his addiction. So I find
And
that
became a health freak.
and became, yes, I absolutely committed to health and promoting the idea that if you want to be a musician and if you want to involve yourself in the jazz tradition, that you can't just focus on music technically, that it really has to be a unified, healthy body, healthy mind.
There's a
Work on your
great
spiritual
moment
health.
when he says, I thought the jazz life was, doing all that shit. And then I met Clifford Brown. And then he realized that, no, the jazz life didn't have to be that at all. It was about your horn.
Yeah, well, Clifford Brown was known for that, and that band was known for that as well. And there was this pivotal moment when Miles Davis wanted Sonny to rejoin the band. He wanted him to join, and he actually put it out there, I think it was in Downbeat, that Sonny had already joined the band. This was not true. And Miles had been booked in Birdland for, I want to say, 20 weeks or something like that. And Sonny's a New Yorker, so he could come home. Meanwhile, the Brown Roach Quintet is barnstorming all over the circuit. And Sonny knew that they were making some of the greatest music that anybody's ever made, but also he knew that it was a clean band.
Right.
And that was part of the reason why he joined that band instead.
Right. And Miles even
Who joins Miles?
Miles Coltrane. Miles even went so far at one point to say, they don't need you. That band is all about Brownie and Max.
Yeah, yes. There was a little spat there. But yes, Miles wanted Sonny.
I think this is the last question. Was he politically active? We talked a little bit about this in the civil rights movement, anti-war. I can't read the last. And the anti-war movement.
Was Sonny Rollins politically active? Absolutely. So this goes all the way back to his early childhood when his grandmother Miriam, who was a follower of Marcus Garvey, used to take him to marches in Harlem. And so he supported Paul Robeson, or they'd be marching for the Scottsboro Boys, all sorts of causes. And Sonny grew up not too far from Liberty Hall, the headquarters of Garvey's organization. So that was just something that he was steeped in through his family and through the milieu coming out of the Harlem Renaissance and growing up in the Great Depression, there was so much political activism going on that he couldn't help but avoid it. So, his grandmother, I believe, had a Black nationalist flag, and he was involved in that from a very early age. He went to a communist summer camp when he was young. And the idea there at that camp was it was an interracial camp, and it was an explicitly Marxist summer camp that Sonny participated in. They also always had jazz musicians performing there. But yes, the Freedom Suite, I would say, is really what exemplifies Sonny's involvement in the civil rights movement. It is the first explicitly civil rights themed album of the hard bop era. It sets the example for Max Roach and Abbey Lincoln's Freedom Now Suite.
Mhm.
And he got a lot of pushback for that album. But once again, he had the strength of his conviction, and he did it. Was Sonny politically active after that? Yes, always, and he still is. And he's very committed to environmentalism, social justice, and still part of the struggle.
Global warming.
That's right. 1998 album, Global Warming, where he also has his own liner notes for that cause. And I don't think that if you asked him then, would we still be confronting climate change deniers 25 years later? But here we are.
All right. Thank you, Aidan. This was, and thank you for this book. I can't recommend this book too highly. I think it's extraordinary, and you just did a magnificent job.
Oh, well, thank you. And, thanks for supporting this book way back when now, I guess almost a decade ago. Biography is it's a long game.
It's a long game.
As I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
We're all waiting for volume 3.
All right. I'll let you know. Thank you and good night.